Gloria Swanson and Constance Bennett are Hollywood's undisputed top predators. They don't just negotiate for supremacy, they hunt it. Their ultimate prize isn't a studio contract, but a bankrupt European Marquis. They forge a forbidden power triangle built on the absolute objectification of a single man. Swanson buys his long-established aristocratic lineage to legitimize her empire. Bennett executes a hostile takeover of that very husband to destroy his rival's ego. Two legendary female warlords, a reborn aristocrat, a cold-blooded hunt where marriage is a corporate weapon and a man's dignity is the ultimate victim. The traditional image of a European marquis is one of immense fortune and unyielding social dominion. Yet the reality for Henri de La Falaise in 1925 painted a starkly contrasting picture. Arriving at the gates of Paramount Pictures, this highly decorated French nobleman was stripped of his ancestral authority, reduced instead to the humiliating status of a mere trophy husband whose primary public duties involved managing his famous spouse's luggage and lingering docilely in the background. This dramatic reversal of fortune was the direct consequence of a seismic macroeconomic upheaval in the wake of the First World War. While countless aristocrats like Henri returned from the trenches to find their sprawling estates decimated and their generational wealth entirely vaporized, the United States was experiencing the roaring ascension of its cinematic golden age. Throughout the 1920s silent film era, a new matriarchy emerged as leading actresses amassed unprecedented capital and ruthless bargaining power. Consequently, Henri found himself trapped as a pawn in the crossfire of rival studio queens. His unique predicament perfectly encapsulates a transactional cultural phenomenon of the era, the desperate bartering of ancient European prestige in exchange for the lavish financial salvation funded by America's newly minted, fiercely independent female tycoons. Gloria Swanson was the absolute apex predator of this era. She was not merely an actress contracted to Paramount Pictures. She was the foundational pillar of the entire corporation. Swanson had crawled her way up from the gritty streets of Chicago. She possessed a terrifying, calculating intelligence. She engineered her own image with the precision of a master watchmaker. She demanded astronomical salaries, creative control, and absolute obedience from the men who managed the studio ledgers. She had famously rejected an unprecedented $1 million a year contract from Adolph Zukor at Paramount to join United Artists, aiming to completely finance and distribute her own independent pictures. This aggressive maneuver forced male executives to negotiate with her as a rival producer rather than a salaried employee. By establishing Gloria Swanson Productions, she secured total control over international distribution rights and merchandising. She was not just starring in the product, she owned the supply chain. Swanson surveyed the Hollywood landscape and identified a critical weakness in her own portfolio. She possessed massive wealth. She possessed global fame. She possessed beauty. But in Los Angeles, wealth and beauty were common commodities. Every young girl stepping off a train from the Midwest had a pretty face, and every oil baron who funded a movie had money. Swanson realized that Hollywood royalty was a synthetic fabrication. The press crowned actors as kings and queens, but it was all cheap grease paint and studio lighting. It was an illusion built on sand. Swanson did not want to be a fake queen. She craved legitimate, undeniable historical supremacy. She wanted an asset that no amount of Paramount money could manufacture on a soundstage. She needed to import genuine old world legitimacy. She needed to purchase a bloodline. During a trip to France to film the epic production Madame Sans-Gêne, Swanson went shopping. She did not browse for jewelry or haute couture. She browsed the decimated ranks of the French aristocracy. She required a specific type of man. He needed to possess a flawless title. He needed to be physically attractive enough to stand beside her in press photographs. And most crucially, he needed to be financially desperate enough to accept the terms of surrender. Henri de La Falaise met all the criteria of the acquisition. He was hired initially as a translator and a liaison for the film production in Paris. He was introduced to the blinding, chaotic orbit of Gloria Swanson. He witnessed the sheer scale of her financial power. He saw the sycophants, the studio executives bowing to her demands, the limitless flow of American dollars. For a bankrupt nobleman facing a future of polite poverty in Paris, Swanson was not just a woman. She was a central bank offering a bailout. The ensuing marriage in 1925 was not an elopement driven by blinding passion. It was a highly publicized, meticulously calculated corporate merger. When Gloria Swanson signed the marriage certificate, she executed a flawless business transaction. She acquired the title of Marquis de La Falaise de la Coudray. When she slipped the wedding ring onto her finger, it functioned as a piece of impenetrable power armor. She completely altered her branding. She was no longer just Gloria Swanson, the actress from Chicago. She was publicly and legally Madame la Marquise. This was a psychological masterstroke. In a single day, she elevated herself above every other woman in the motion picture industry. She forced the studio executives, the directors, the gossip columnists, and her bitter rivals to address her with the reverence of European royalty. She had successfully weaponized the concept of marriage. The wedding ring did not signify submission to a husband. It signified the total submission of the husband to her public relations machinery. Henri de La Falaise boarded a luxury ocean liner bound for the United States, leaving the ruins of Europe behind. He likely believed he was entering a new world where his title would grant him the immediate respect and authority he had been bred to expect. He likely believed that his wife, despite her massive wealth, would naturally defer to his aristocratic superiority once the initial excitement of the wedding faded. He was dangerously out of touch with Hollywood's brutal reality. He was entirely blind to the ruthless, capitalist machinery that had just acquired him. He did not understand that in Hollywood, a title without an attached bank account is merely a costume. The moment Henri stepped off the train in California, the brutal reality of his new existence began to manifest. He was not greeted as a conquering nobleman. He was greeted as an expensive piece of luggage that Swanson had brought back from her European vacation. The flashing cameras were not aimed at him. They were aimed through him, focused entirely on the woman who owned his last name. Swanson immediately put her new asset to work. The title of Marquise was plastered across movie posters, press releases, and newspaper headlines. The studio marketing department worked overtime to sell the narrative of the American Cinderella who had legally conquered the French aristocracy. Henri's face was utilized to sell movie tickets. His bloodline was monetized to boost Paramount's quarterly earnings. But the true creeping horror for Henri de La Falaise lay in the daily suffocating mechanics of his marriage. Swanson had purchased a title, but she had absolutely no use for a traditional husband. She did not require his protection. She did not require his financial provision. She did not require his leadership. She required his obedience. Henri quickly discovered that his primary function was strictly ornamental. He was expected to accompany his wife to industry events, dressed immaculately in a tuxedo, providing a sophisticated European backdrop to her aggressive American glamour. He was expected to stand silently while studio executives discussed multi-million-dollar distribution deals with his wife. He was a silent partner in a firm where he held 0 voting shares. The emasculation was total, and it was engineered by a woman who fully understood the power dynamics of capital. Swanson held the purse strings, and therefore she held the leash. She dictated where they lived, who they socialized with, and how Henri was permitted to present himself to the press. The Marquis de la Falaise, a man whose ancestors had commanded vast estates, was now living on a strict allowance provided by a woman who made her fortune pretending to be other people in front of a wooden box. This was the opening gambit in a much larger, far more vicious game. Gloria Swanson had established the precedent. She had proven that male dignity, even the highest echelon of European nobility, could be bought for the right price and utilized as a weapon against her rivals. She had set the board. Swanson demanded absolute deference from her peers, essentially forcing the Hollywood elite to bow to her husband at industry events. Constance Bennett, watching from the RKO lot, refused to participate in this charade. She saw Swanson's insistence on European etiquette not as sophistication, but as a glaring insecurity masking her working-class Chicago roots. Bennett quietly began calculating the exact financial cost of stripping Swanson of that aristocratic shield. The Marquis was no longer just a husband. He had become the designated target in a high-stakes psychological war between 2 rival studios. But Swanson, in her towering arrogance, failed to calculate the volatility of the asset she had acquired. She viewed Henri as a permanent fixture in her display case. She forgot that in the Hollywood ecosystem, there are always other predators watching the board. There are women who do not want to build their own empires from scratch, but prefer to wait in the shadows, waiting for a rival to expose a weakness. Constance Bennett was watching, and she understood a fundamental truth about Hollywood that Swanson had briefly forgotten. An asset only holds its value as long as the market demands it. When the market shifts, the asset is discarded, and a discarded asset can be picked up, recycled, and repurposed into the most devastating psychological weapon in the history of the studio system. Bennett did not wait for the ink to dry on Swanson's divorce papers before initiating contact. She utilized her vast network of studio fixers to monitor Henri's rapidly depleting bank accounts. When he could no longer afford his tab at the Brown Derby, Bennett stepped in as the primary creditor. She did not offer him a loan. She offered him a seamless transition from one corporate sponsor to another. This calculated interception guaranteed that Henri never had the opportunity to regain his financial independence. The destruction of Henri de La Falaise's identity had only just begun. The Paramount Queen had bought him, but the RKO Fox was preparing to steal him. The absolute structural humiliation of Henri de La Falaise was not an accident. It was a meticulously engineered corporate policy designed by Gloria Swanson to guarantee her total supremacy. When a self-made American capitalist purchases a European aristocrat, she does not place him on a pedestal. She places him on a leash. and Swanson ensured that the leash was woven entirely out of Paramount Pictures' corporate funds. The mechanism of this emasculation was executed through the studio payroll department. Swanson possessed enough leverage over the Paramount executives to demand that her new husband be officially employed by the corporation. On paper, Henri de La Falaise was given a title. He was listed as an executive, a consultant, or a European representative. In the physical reality of the Culver City studio lot, he was a ghost. Henri was granted an office, but he possessed no telephone lines that connected to anyone of consequence. He was given a desk, but no scripts were placed upon it for his approval. He possessed no budget, no authority to hire or fire, and no input on the creative or financial direction of his wife's films. His daily routine consisted of arriving at the studio in impeccably tailored Parisian suits, sitting in an empty room and waiting for his wife to summon him. When the call came, his actual job commenced. His function was to serve as a mobile, breathing piece of set dressing. When Swanson walked from her dressing room to the sound stage, Henri was required to trail exactly 3 paces behind her. He carried her script. He held her mirrored compact. When the Hollywood press corps descended upon the set, flashing their magnesium bulbs and shouting questions, Henri was instructed to stand slightly to the side, maintaining a rigid, dignified posture. He was the visual proof of Swanson's imported royalty. The psychological toll this inflicted on a man raised in the deeply patriarchal, centuries-old traditions of the French aristocracy is staggering to dissect. Henri had been bred from birth to believe that his bloodline granted him an inherent right to command. He had survived the horrors of the First World War trenches, earning military decorations for actual physical bravery. He knew what it meant to lead men into artillery fire, yet in the artificial climate of Los Angeles, his military medals and his ancient lineage were completely worthless. The only currency that mattered was box office revenue, and Henri generated 0 revenue for her studio. He was entirely dependent on a woman. Every dollar he spent, every meal he consumed, every custom-made automobile he drove was financed by the physical labor of his wife. When they dined at the exclusive restaurants on Sunset Boulevard, surrounded by the ruthless power brokers of the industry, the bill was quietly handed to Swanson. Henri was stripped of the most fundamental patriarchal duty, the ability to provide. He was reduced to the status of a kept woman operating within a gender-reversed financial dictatorship. Swanson did not attempt to soften this blow. She utilized his dependency to reinforce her own brand. She openly flaunted his title, forcing the American public and the Hollywood elite to refer to her as Madame la Marquise. She threw lavish, grotesquely expensive parties at her Beverly Hills mansion, positioning Henri at the door to greet the guests, effectively treating him as a highly decorated butler. She had purchased a thoroughbred racehorse, but instead of letting it run, she stuffed it and mounted it in her living room. This transactional dynamic functioned flawlessly as long as the market conditions remained stable. The Marquis provided the prestige, and Swanson provided the capital. But the Hollywood studio system is a hyper-volatile market. It does not tolerate stagnation, and it violently rejects overhead costs that fail to yield a continuous return on investment. By the dawn of 1930, the fundamental architecture of the motion picture industry was shifting, and Gloria Swanson's empire was facing catastrophic turbulence. The luxury market that sustained the illusion of the marquee was collapsing overnight. Swanson's lavish European-style parties, which once dictated Hollywood's social hierarchy, suddenly appeared deeply offensive to an impoverished public. Constance Bennett recognized this shift instantly and began repositioning her own image toward a sharper, more cynical, modern American woman. She knew Swanson was trapped in the aesthetic of the 1920s, heavily anchored by the dead weight of her titled husband. The Great Depression had decimated the American economy, drastically shrinking the disposable income of the movie-going public. Simultaneously, the industry underwent the brutal transition from silent films to talkies. The microphone ruthlessly exposed the flaws of the silent era stars, demanding new types of performances and rendering the old melodramatic acting styles obsolete. Swanson's theatrical, heavily pantomimed performances, which had defined the silent era's visual language, suddenly registered as stiff and artificial when paired with synchronized sound. Furthermore, the immense cost of retrofitting independent studios with Western electric sound equipment financially paralyzed self-financed producers. While massive conglomerates could absorb the infrastructural shock, Swanson's boutique production company was left stranded without the required capital to upgrade its sound stages. Swanson's financial portfolio was bleeding. She had aggressively pursued independent production, breaking away from the safety of the Paramount hierarchy to finance her own films. She became entangled in a disastrous, highly publicized affair with Joseph P. Kennedy, a ruthless East Coast financier who took control of her production company. Together, they produced the film Queen Kelly. The production was a sprawling, chaotic nightmare that went massively over budget, suffered from severe censorship issues, and ultimately failed to secure a domestic release. Swanson lost millions of dollars. Her absolute grip on the Hollywood hierarchy was slipping. In a corporate crisis, a smart CEO immediately liquidates non-essential assets to free up capital. Gloria Swanson was a very smart CEO. While Swanson hemorrhaged cash and dodged East Coast creditors, Constance Bennett was across town negotiating a record-breaking contract, guaranteeing her $300,000 for just 10 weeks of work. Bennett achieved this astronomical rate by operating as a highly liquid freelance agent rather than binding herself to a long-term, restrictive studio contract. She understood that major studios were desperate for established stars who could flawlessly handle spoken dialogue, allowing her to exploit their tight production schedules and demand unprecedented per-film salaries. Her crisp, patrician vocal delivery and modern, unsentimental on-screen persona perfectly matched the cynical tone of the early 1930s. She essentially forced Warner Brothers and RKO to bid against each other for her services. Bennett ruthlessly weaponized this disparity. She pressured the industry trades to print her astronomical earnings directly beside the reports of Swanson's impending bankruptcy. The inevitable transfer of the marquee was not a romance. It was a highly visible transfer of Hollywood supremacy from a failing CEO to a highly liquid competitor. Backed into a financial corner, Swanson scrutinized her own ledgers and the shifting public mood. The American audience, plunged into the brutal poverty of the Depression, was rapidly losing its appetite for imported European royalty and aristocratic excess. They wanted gritty realism, sharp comedies, and working-class heroes. The title of Madame la Marquise, which had been a brilliant marketing tool in 1925, was suddenly becoming a PR liability. It made Swanson look out of touch, arrogant, and excessively wealthy at a time when her audience was standing in breadlines. Henri de La Falaise had depreciated. His public relations value had hit zero. He was now merely an expensive financial burden. The liquidation of the Marquis was executed with clinical precision. In 1930, Gloria Swanson filed for divorce. There were no grand tragic scenes of heartbreak. There was no desperate fight to save the marriage. It was a boardroom restructuring. Swanson simply cut the cord. She severed his access to her bank accounts, evicted him from her narrative, and dropped his title from her press releases. She reverted to being Gloria Swanson, the independent American businesswoman fighting to save her production company. Henri was abruptly discarded. He was left stranded in Los Angeles, permanently stripped of his paramount protection and his corporate allowance. Publicly branded as a discontinued product, the 32-year-old possessed a title that no longer held any currency. He was completely abandoned, lacking the financial infrastructure and the predatory instincts required to navigate the brutal Hollywood ecosystem without a wealthy female sponsor. In a normal, civilized society, a man in Henri's position would have quietly retreated. He would have booked a third-class ticket on a steamship back to France, swallowed his pride, and faded into the obscure, crumbling remains of the European aristocracy. But Hollywood is not a civilized society. It is an ecosystem composed entirely of scavengers. Nothing of perceived value is ever allowed to simply rot. If a piece of intellectual property is abandoned by one studio, it is immediately seized, rebranded, and weaponized by a rival. While Henri was drifting through the margins of the Los Angeles social scene, trying to maintain the illusion of aristocratic dignity on an empty wallet, he was being observed. The apex predators of the studio system were analyzing his sudden availability, and one predator in particular saw an unprecedented opportunity to execute the most humiliating, psychologically devastating corporate strike in the history of the Golden Age. Enter Constance Bennett. If Gloria Swanson was the aggressive, self-made pioneer of the 1920s, Constance Bennett was the razor-sharp, hyper-capitalist perfection of the 1930s. Bennett did not crawl her way up from the gutter. She was born into a formidable theatrical dynasty. She understood the mechanics of the entertainment industry as an inherited science. Bennett possessed a cold, terrifyingly sharp beauty. She was blonde, sleek, and projected an aura of absolute impenetrable cynicism. She did not act for the love of the craft. She acted for the acquisition of capital. She was a mercenary. At the peak of her power, she negotiated a contract with Warner Brothers and RKO that paid her an astonishing $30,000 a week. She was the highest paid female star in the world, and she demanded that every single dollar be delivered on time. Bennett operated with a complete lack of sentimentality. She viewed Hollywood strictly as a marketplace, and she viewed everyone in it as either an asset, a liability, or a competitor. And she viewed Gloria Swanson as a target. Swanson and Bennett occupied the same rarefied airspace at the absolute top of the industry. They were both aggressively independent, incredibly wealthy, and famously arrogant. A collision between them was inevitable. But Bennett did not want to attack Swanson at the box office. She wanted to dismantle her legacy. She wanted to prove publicly and permanently that she was the superior operator. When Constance Bennett looked at the discarded, bankrupt Henri de La Falaise, she did not see a man in need of rescue. She saw a weapon lying in the dirt. She saw a piece of Swanson's intellectual property that had been carelessly left unguarded. Bennett understood the exact psychological weight of the Marquis title. She knew that Gloria Swanson had spent millions of dollars, leveraged her entire corporate influence, and dedicated 5 years of aggressive public relations to drag the title of Madame la Marquise into the Hollywood consciousness. Swanson had built that brand. She had bled to legitimize it. Constance Bennett realized that if she acquired Henri, she would not have to spend a single dime on marketing. The infrastructure was already built. The public already knew the title. Bennett simply had to pick it up, dust it off, and fasten it around her own neck. In 1931, Constance Bennett executed the hostile takeover. She married Henri de La Falaise. Bennett timed the wedding announcement to inflict maximum damage on Swanson's remaining prestige. She strategically leaked the details to syndicated columnists on the exact day Swanson was attempting to secure funding for a new picture. The Hollywood press immediately abandoned Swanson's business struggles to focus entirely on Bennett's aristocratic acquisition. Investors backed away from the former Paramount Queen, recognizing that her era of absolute dominance had ended. Bennett had used a marriage certificate to successfully sabotage her rival's access to production capital. This was not a marriage of convenience. It was an act of corporate terrorism. Bennett did not attempt to rebrand Henri. She did not try to carve out a new identity for him. She deliberately, meticulously utilized the exact same branding that Swanson had paid for. She immediately instructed the RKO publicity department to blanket the national press with her new official title. Constance Bennett forced the entire Hollywood establishment, the gossip columnists, the studio executives, and the American public to address her as Madame la Marquise. This dynamic created highly volatile encounters at industry functions. Hotel concierge and restaurant maitre d's were caught in the crossfire, terrified of using the title for the wrong woman. Swanson would arrive at the Coconut Grove only to find Bennett already seated, openly wearing the aristocratic designation like a stolen crown. Bennett made a point of loudly conversing in flawless imported French, a skill Swanson had never fully mastered. It was a calculated daily performance designed to remind Swanson that her most expensive asset had been successfully annexed. The psychological devastation this inflicted upon Gloria Swanson is almost impossible to quantify. Swanson was forced to open the daily trade papers and see her bitterest, sharpest rival wearing her exact title. She was forced to watch Bennett parade down the red carpets of Los Angeles with the very man Swanson had imported, paid for, and trained. It was the ultimate cold-blooded flex of Hollywood capitalism. Bennett sent a message directly to Swanson's front door, written in the ink of the daily tabloids. The message was unmistakable. The most exclusive aristocratic item Swanson ever owned was now Bennett's discounted hand-me-down. Bennett had successfully stolen Swanson's aristocratic legacy without expending a single drop of her own sweat. She had hijacked a multi-million-dollar PR campaign simply by signing a marriage license with a desperate, bankrupt man. She had proven that in the brutal hierarchy of the studio system, loyalty did not exist. history could be overwritten overnight, and even the most sacred markers of European nobility could be passed around like a cheap prop. But if the acquisition was a triumph for Constance Bennett, it was an absolute unmitigated nightmare for Henri de La Falaise. When Henri married Bennett, he likely believed he had secured a lifeline. He likely assumed that his new wife, possessing even more liquid capital than his previous one, would restore him to a position of comfortable, ornamental dignity. He assumed he would resume his role as the sophisticated European backdrop, attending parties and smiling for the cameras. He severely miscalculated the cruelty of his new owner. Gloria Swanson had treated Henri like a stuffed trophy. Constance Bennett treated him like an intern. Swanson had insisted Henri wear formal, conservative Parisian tailoring to emphasize his old-world origins. Bennett immediately stripped him of this visual dignity. She forced him into casual, aggressively Americanized leisure wear, effectively erasing the visual markers of his nobility. When Swanson saw him photographed in these clothes, the insult was undeniable. Bennett was proving she didn't just own Swanson's former husband, she had the power to fundamentally alter his identity. Bennett had no intention of letting Henri sit idle. She was a woman who despised wasted capital. If she was paying for his tailored suits, his housing, and his meals, she demanded a tangible return on her investment. And because Henri possessed no immediate marketable skills in the motion picture industry, Bennett put him to work in the only capacity he was qualified for: manual labor. Bennett had established her own independent production company to maximize her profits. She inserted Henri into the corporate structure of this company, but not as an executive. The historical records and studio logs from the early 1930s paint a picture of staggering humiliation. The Marquis de La Falaise, a man holding a title granted by French royalty, was routinely dispatched by his wife to run menial errands across the RKO studio lot. By formally embedding him within the lower tiers of Constance Bennett Productions, she ensured his daily tasks were scrutinized by her own accountants and staff. He was frequently tasked with delivering minor script revisions or fetching wardrobe approvals, effectively stripping him of any executive decision-making power. This arrangement fundamentally inverted the standard industry practice, where male producers dictated terms to female stars, visually demonstrating her absolute control over both her capital and her spouse. While Henri did possess cinematic ambitions, eventually directing his own independent documentaries like Le Gong, Dance of the Virgins, under Bennett's immediate regime, his aristocratic title was systematically overshadowed by her corporate brand. His independent efforts were routinely eclipsed by the sheer, crushing weight of his wife's massive financial machinery. Constance Bennett did not hide this dynamic. She flaunted it. She openly ordered him around in front of industry executives, demonstrating her absolute, uncompromising dominance. She had not just purchased a title, she had purchased a servant who happened to possess a title. The human ego is not shattered by a single violent blow. It is eroded by 1,000 daily, meticulously calculated humiliations. The absolute psychological destruction of Henri de La Falaise under Constance Bennett's regime left no physical bruises. The violence was recorded entirely in the financial ledgers. The architecture of their marriage functioned exclusively as a punitive corporate subsidiary designed to extract value and enforce total submission. Constance Bennett did not merely employ her husband as a glorified errand boy on the RKO studio lot. That was simply the physical manifestation of his subjugation. The true horror of Henri's existence in the 1930s lay in the systematic public erasure of his fundamental identity. He was subjected to a phenomenon that the Hollywood press corps ruthlessly dubbed the Mr. Superstar syndrome, but Bennett weaponized it with a cruelty that was entirely unprecedented. In the patriarchal society of the 1930s, a man's last name was his absolute domain. It was the legal and social umbrella under which his wife and children existed. The Marquis de La Falaise de la Coudray possessed a name that had commanded respect across the European continent for centuries. Constance Bennett annihilated that name. When they attended the sprawling, aggressively opulent industry parties hosted by men like William Randolph Hearst or Louis B. Mayer, Henri was not announced as the Marquis. The Hollywood reporters, the syndicated gossip columnists, and the studio executives universally referred to him, straight to his face and in the daily tabloids, as Mr. Constance Bennett. This deliberate misnaming operated as an informal extension of the morals clauses standard in contemporary studio contracts, which sought to control every aspect of a star's public life. Bennett weaponized this media strategy to signal to the RKO board of directors that her personal life posed no threat to her production schedule. By publicly domesticating La Falaise, she preemptively neutralized any studio executive's concern that a demanding European aristocrat might interfere with her legendary work ethic. During the Swanson years, the press had at least maintained the illusion of his independence by using his proper title in print. Bennett actively dismantled that residual respect. She explicitly instructed her RKO publicists to correct any journalist who referred to him as the Marquis. Bennett wanted the world to know that while Swanson had merely rented a nobleman, she had completely domesticated one. The title was hers to use, but the man himself was reduced to a nameless subordinate. This was not a slip of the tongue. It was a coordinated, industry-wide strategy of emasculation. The Hollywood press functioned as an extension of the studio's public relations departments. They knew exactly who signed the checks, and they knew exactly who held the power. By calling him Mr. Constance Bennett, the industry permanently revoked his aristocratic passport. They stripped him of his ancestral history and legally bound his entire existence to the brand identity of his wife. He was no longer a person. He was a corporate appendage. Bennett did not correct the press. She encouraged it. She utilized Henri's public humiliation as a tool to assert her dominance over the male studio executives. When Bennett sat at the negotiating table with the ruthless men who ran RKO Pictures, demanding astronomical salaries and unprecedented script approval, she brought her husband. She positioned him quietly in the corner of the boardroom. He was a visual aid. Bennett was demonstrating to the studio heads that she possessed the financial firepower to domesticate a European nobleman, to strip him of his authority, and to force him to sit silently while she conducted multi-million-dollar transactions. She was looking the male executives directly in the eye and stating without uttering a single word, "I own one of you. Do not attempt to dictate terms to me." Henri never walked out the door because his cage was lined with silk. He was a prisoner of the velvet trap. He had traded the agonizing, freezing poverty of post-war Paris for a life of perpetual sunshine, tailored silk suits, and unlimited access to the highest echelons of global wealth. But he did not own a single thread of the suits he wore. Bennett controlled the bank accounts with absolute tyrannical precision. Henri operated on a strict, closely monitored allowance. He could not purchase a pack of cigarettes, buy a drink at the Trocadero, or tip a valet without utilizing funds generated by his wife's labor. He was financially infantilized. If he demanded a divorce, if he attempted to reclaim his dignity, he would be instantly exiled from the Hollywood ecosystem. Outside the protective, heavily funded bubble of Constance Bennett's bank account, Henri's options were brutally limited. The man who would later attempt to direct independent films was, in this moment, a middle-aged aristocrat whose primary currency was an obsolete title. Faced with the choice between dignified starvation and humiliated luxury, Henri chose the luxury. He became complicit in his own objectification. Henri quietly attempted to secure funding from French expatriate investors to launch his own production company and escape Bennett's payroll. Bennett discovered the plan and systematically threatened to blacklist any financier who backed him. She used her immense box office leverage to ensure no independent studio would touch him. Swanson watched this absolute suppression from the sidelines, offering no assistance to the man she had originally brought to America. He was trapped in a financial quarantine built by his second wife. While his first wife refused to throw him a lifeline, he accepted the allowance. He accepted the title of Mr. Constance Bennett. He traded his aristocratic autonomy for room and board, proving that male pride possesses a specific, calculable breaking point when confronted with the threat of absolute poverty. As the 1930s ground on, the cultural landscape of America shifted violently, and Henri's position within the Hollywood hierarchy transformed from an ornamental asset into a glaring, highly visible liability. The Great Depression was deepening, ravaging the American working class. The public's tolerance for stories of imported idle European royalty evaporated. The citizens who were scraping together nickels to afford a movie ticket did not want to see their hard-earned money funding the lavish, aggressively useless lifestyle of a French aristocrat who contributed absolutely nothing to the economy. The Hollywood studios, possessing highly sensitive demographic radars, registered this shift in consumer hostility. The concept of the trophy husband was no longer a fascinating anomaly. It was becoming a symbol of out-of-touch, gross cinematic excess. Constance Bennett, whose entire career was built on calculating market trends, recognized that the Marquis brand was rapidly depreciating. Her husband was no longer a status symbol. The outbreak of war in Europe finalized this shift in market value. American audiences viewed French aristocrats with deep suspicion, associating them with the rapid collapse of the French Republic. Swanson, observing from a distance, had already successfully rebranded herself as a resilient, independent American survivor. Bennett, however, was now stuck holding an obsolete European commodity. The very weapon Bennett had used to destroy Swanson's ego was now actively damaging her own box office returns. He was an anchor. He represented a bygone era of the roaring 20s that the American public actively despised. The gossip columnists, sensing the shift in the wind, stopped treating Henri with polite amusement and began targeting him with open vitriolic contempt. Writers like Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper built their careers on destroying the illusions of the studio system. They recognized Henri as the weakest, most defenseless target on the board. These columnists operated as the unofficial enforcers for the studio bosses, and Bennett frequently fed them ammunition. She allowed stories to circulate detailing exactly how much she paid for Henri's gambling debts and custom shoes. This strategic leaking insulated Bennett from the public backlash. She framed herself as the hard-working American woman burdened by a lazy European. Swanson watched the press annihilate the man she had once demanded the world respect, silently acknowledging Bennett's mastery of media manipulation. They published thinly veiled blind items mocking his financial dependency. They ridiculed his lack of employment. They questioned his masculinity in print, broadcasting his subservience to millions of readers across the country. Henri was stripped of his final layer of defense. He could no longer even pretend to be a dignified, silent partner. He was transformed into a national punchline. He was the court jester of the studio system, a man paraded out to demonstrate the grotesque, inverted power dynamics of the Hollywood elite. Bennett did not intervene to protect him from the press. In the ruthless logic of her personal corporation, defending a depreciating asset is a waste of capital. She allowed the media to tear him apart, utilizing the negative press to distance herself from the Marquis' image she had aggressively stolen from Gloria Swanson just a few years prior. Bennett was preparing to pivot her brand, and a pivot requires shedding dead weight. Henri de La Falaise found himself entirely isolated. He was trapped in a foreign country, married to a woman who viewed him as a bad investment, mocked by a press corps that despised him, and entirely reliant on the very system that was actively destroying his sanity. He existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the inevitable moment when the CEO would finally officially terminate his contract. Henri's destruction was only possible because of the unregulated gold rush of 1920s Hollywood, a brief window where box office revenue completely dismantled the traditional patriarchy. The Hollywood of the 1920s and 1930s was an anomaly in the history of global economics. It was a brief, highly volatile window where the traditional patriarchal structures of American society were violently suspended by the sheer force of box office revenue. In the early days of the motion picture industry, before the male-dominated studio monopolies consolidated their iron grip and standardized the contracts in the late 1930s, power was decentralized. It rested entirely in the hands of the individuals who could guarantee ticket sales. The absolute, unquestioned authority wielded by women like Gloria Swanson and Constance Bennett completely defied the social norms of the 1930s. Their empires operated strictly under the brutal, unforgiving laws of unregulated capitalism. Swanson and Bennett were not just actresses navigating a male-dominated town. They were the banks. They were the central economic pillars holding up the roofs of Paramount and RKO. They generated millions of dollars in an era when there was no income tax structure designed to inhibit the accumulation of massive personal wealth. They possessed the leverage to dictate terms, demand script approval, and build independent production companies. When you possess that level of liquid capital, you do not conform to gender roles. You purchase them. You rewrite them. Henri de La Falaise walked into a trap that he was fundamentally incapable of perceiving. The European aristocracy operated on a system of feudal inheritance. In France, power was static. It was tied to the land, the bloodline, and the name. It did not matter if a marquis was completely bankrupt. His societal superiority was guaranteed by history. He expected the American actors, no matter how wealthy, to instinctively defer to his ancient pedigree. He viewed Hollywood as a colony ripe for aristocratic influence. He did not understand that Hollywood operates on a system of aggressive, hyper-accelerated capitalism. In Los Angeles, history does not exist. The past is irrelevant. The only metric of human value is the current box office gross. A bloodline cannot be deposited into a bank account. Therefore, a bloodline has zero inherent corporate value. Its only worth is its capacity to be utilized as a marketing gimmick. The moment Henri signed the marriage certificate with Gloria Swanson, he subjected himself to a corporate hierarchy where he was the lowest-ranking employee. He was not marrying a woman, he was being acquired by a conglomerate. The legal and financial structures of these marriages were designed with ruthless efficiency. Swanson, and later Bennett, ensured that their wealth remained entirely isolated from their husband. Through prenuptial agreements and the rigid control of their production companies, they guaranteed that Henri possessed no legal claim to their real estate portfolios, their stock options, or their future earnings. He was placed on a strict allowance, completely severing his ability to build independent wealth. This financial castration was the cornerstone of his subjugation. If a man controls his own money, he controls his exit strategy. By cutting off his access to capital, Swanson and Bennett guaranteed his absolute compliance. He could not leave them without facing immediate, devastating poverty. He was a hostage to his own lifestyle. This dynamic shattered the sanitized mythology of the Golden Age. While lower-tier contract players fought desperately against oppressive male studio bosses, the female apex predators operated with a different directive. Women like Swanson and Bennett did not dismantle the patriarchy. They aggressively hijacked it. They did not seek to create an egalitarian society. They sought absolute domination. When they acquired the power and capital traditionally held by men, they exhibited the exact same predatory, objectifying, and abusive behaviors as their male counterparts. They bought a younger, attractive partner. They stripped him of his autonomy. They utilized his physical presence to enhance their public image. They forced him to endure public humiliation to assert their dominance. And when his physical appearance or his public relations value depreciated, they executed a swift, emotionless divorce. Henri de La Falaise was subjected to the exact same mechanics of exploitation that defined the studio contract system, but it was executed within the legal framework of a marriage. He traded his body, his name, and his dignity for room and board. The Hollywood press corps, functioning as the enforcement arm of the studios, actively participated in this destruction. The syndicated columnists recognized the power dynamic instantly. They knew that Constance Bennett could destroy a reporter's career by revoking their access to the RKO lot. They knew Henri possessed zero leverage to retaliate. Therefore, the press operated with absolute impunity when mocking the Marquis. The daily tabloids functioned as a public ledger of his emasculation. The journalists did not question the morality of Bennett treating her husband like a servant. They celebrated it. They framed it as a triumph of American financial ingenuity over European pretension. The American public, suffering through the agonizing economic realities of the Great Depression, relished the spectacle of a wealthy, arrogant European nobleman being reduced to fetching coffee for an American actress. It was class warfare disguised as entertainment, and Henri was the designated highly visible casualty. His psychological deterioration was a public spectacle, sanctioned and subsidized by the very women who swore to honor him. The destruction of his ego was not collateral damage, it was the core product. Swanson and Bennett sold his humiliation to the press to solidify their own reputations as untouchable, ruthless operators who could tame the old world with a checkbook. This is the brutal legacy of the recycled Marquis. He serves as a historical autopsy of Hollywood's transactional nature. He proves that in the ecosystem of the studio system, human dignity is a depreciating asset, and empathy is a severe corporate liability. The transaction was complete. The ancient aristocratic blood of Europe had been successfully extracted, monetized, and depleted by the American cinematic machine. Henri had nothing left to offer. He possessed no more public relations value. He generated no corporate revenue. He was a hollowed-out shell, a title without a man attached to it. The final accounting of this brutal corporate merger was approaching. Constance Bennett was finalizing the paperwork. The liquidation of the recycled Marquis was imminent, and the disposal process would prove to be even more clinical and far more absolute than his acquisition. The machinery of Hollywood capitalism does not possess a conscience. It possesses a balance sheet. And on a balance sheet, every single item is eventually categorized as either an asset generating revenue or a liability draining capital. By the year 1940, the world was fracturing. The globe was plunging into the catastrophic abyss of the Second World War. The cultural appetite of the American public shifted with a violent, terrifying speed. The moviegoers, sitting in the darkened theaters of a nation preparing for global conflict, had zero tolerance for the frivolous, imported aristocratic excess of the previous decade. They did not want to see European noblemen sipping champagne in Beverly Hills mansions, while London burned and the American economy braced for total mobilization. The title of Madame la Marquise, which Gloria Swanson had ruthlessly purchased in 1925, and which Constance Bennett had vindictively stolen in 1931, was no longer a symbol of ultimate cinematic supremacy. It was an optical disaster. It was a glaring, offensive reminder of an era of out-of-touch, useless wealth. Constance Bennett, the undisputed mercenary of the RKO lot, possessed a survival instinct that bordered on the predatory. She did not operate on sentimentality. She operated on market trends. She looked at the shifting geopolitical landscape. She looked at her declining box office returns. She looked at the man sitting in her aggressively opulent living room, the man whose tailored suits and daily existence were entirely financed by her physical labor on the sound stages. Henri de La Falaise had officially transitioned from a weapon of psychological warfare into a massive, unjustifiable overhead cost. The utility of the recycled Marquis had expired. Constance Bennett had successfully utilized him to humiliate Gloria Swanson a decade prior. She had paraded him in front of the Hollywood press corps, forcing her rival to watch her hand-me-down nobleman be treated as a corporate subordinate on the RKO lot. The public relations stunt had been a flawless, brutal victory, but a PR stunt cannot be sustained indefinitely. Once the initial shock value evaporates, you are simply left paying the bills for a man who contributes nothing to the corporation. Constance Bennett executed the liquidation of her husband with the same terrifying clinical detachment she used to negotiate her $30,000 a week contracts. In 1940, she filed for divorce. Bennett did not even bother to notify Henri in person before contacting her legal team. She simply instructed her business manager to present him with the finalized papers and a severely limited severance check. Swanson, who had initiated the cycle of his commodification, offered no public comment on his final disposal. The two rivals, having completely exhausted his value, simply left him stranded in a town that no longer recognized his name. There was no tragic Hollywood narrative spun for the press. The separation was handled like the brutal liquidation of a bankrupt subsidiary. Bennett summarily terminated his employment, severing his access to her bank accounts and stripping his corporate allowance. He was unceremoniously dumped from the payroll, cutting off his financial oxygen in Los Angeles. The press, having spent years mocking his subservience, barely registered the divorce, noting only that the high-paid actress had finally liquidated her excess overhead. The brutal reality of Henri's existence came crashing down the moment the divorce papers were signed. He was 42 years old. He possessed a title that originated in the medieval courts of France, but he possessed absolutely zero liquid capital in the United States. While he had managed to direct a few independent ethnographic films in the mid-1930s, these minor successes were completely eclipsed by his primary public role. A financially castrated accessory for two of the wealthiest women in the world. Stripped of Bennett's backing, his independent network was too weak to sustain him in the brutal studio ecosystem. He had traded his aristocratic birthright for absolute financial dependency, only to be liquidated the moment his corporate sponsor deemed him a liability. Swanson and Bennett treated their marriages as corporate maneuvers. They built their empires, then discarded Henri when his PR value expired. Henri died in Mallorca in 1972. His passing barely registered in Hollywood, and his obituary simply listed his famous wives. He became a historical footnote, proof that the studio system treated people and titles as disposable commodities. In the end, Henri's life was defined by the rivalry of the two women who purchased him. Their battlefield was the studio ledger. They showed the industry how to use legal systems and the press to systematically ruin a partner. This tactic set a blueprint for the 1940s. But purchasing a hollow aristocratic title was just a surface-level game. The next war would move past titles to target the financial lifeblood of a Hollywood empire. The ultimate revenge was coming next, a battle where divorce settlements were used to seize corporate control and millions in intellectual property. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell as we explore this next chapter of Hollywood's history